President Trump ratcheting up his immigration crackdown as he confirms that immigration raids are in fact starting this weekend.
President Trump sending this message ahead of sweeping deportation raids set to take place this Sunday.
They came in illegally, they go out legally.
The operation coming 3 weeks after President Trump first announced it. ICE officials are expected to launch raids that could reportedly be in as many as 10 major cities.
So we are really specifically looking for bad players,
but also those with final deportation orders. Earlier this week, ICE showing up to this family's home in Los Angeles, an early indication of what could happen this weekend.
ICE came to their house early in the morning, and there were 15 ICE agents, 15 for one family.
President Trump says he's backed by the support of many American mayors, but mayors from several of the 10 cities expected to be targeted have spoken out against ICE's plans.
We want to make sure that people know that we are trying to take care of everyone in our city.
Ahead of the operation, hundreds of demonstrators gathered in places like Philadelphia, Michigan, and Milwaukee to protest the raids and demand detention camps be closed.
This is not America.
ABC News has confirmed that ICE is already operating beyond capacity and are housing more people than they have beds for. And this morning, Democratic Congresswomen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley, who recently toured some detention centers along the border, testified about what they say are inhumane conditions at these centers.
I believe them when they said they were sleeping on concrete floors for 2 months.
Joining us now to discuss, journalist Jonathan Haggerty. He's also the manager of criminal justice and civil liberties at the group R Street. Jonathan, when we talk about the border and border-related issues, we hear a lot of guesses as to the causes of some of the problems. Is it, Mexican officials doing enough or not doing enough when it comes to controlling the border? Same on the American side. Is it the American economy? Is it the economy in Central America? You wrote a piece with Arthur Reisner back in April that pointed to another reason why we're seeing such swollen numbers of people being stopped at the border. Talk a little bit about the zero tolerance policy from the Trump administration.
Sure. So part of the issue in terms of just the sheer volume of people that are at the border right now is due simply to conditions in their home countries, largely in the Northern Triangle countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In terms of the zero tolerance policy, that was essentially a directive from the DOJ that forced prosecutors to charge criminally all illegal entry cases. Now, traditionally, those have been handled through civil immigration courts, so you'll get a deportation and a fine, but as part of zero tolerance, they had to take them to criminal court. From where I stand, I work at a conservative think tank on criminal justice issues. This is a bad policy. It was horrendous for public safety because it forced prosecutors to go after these low-level cases instead of going after actually serious public safety crimes.
So for all the talk we hear, this is a policy that goes back to Obama, or this is a problem that's happening in the Triangle countries, or Mexico's not doing enough. In your mind, this is a Trump policy initiative that is, if not creating, then certainly worsening the problems that we're seeing at the border.
Certainly. So Obama's immigration policy is not without its flaws, but they did prioritize or allow federal prosecutors to prioritize the cases that they would pursue. The zero tolerance policy did not do that. It forced prosecutors to go after these lower level misdemeanor entry cases to the exclusion of these other more serious crimes. Now, when the family separations began to happen, which happened under zero tolerance because children cannot be kept in federal jail with their parents and they were being charged with a crime, after that happened, we then saw the president sort of reel it back and say that we would not be charging everyone who was with a family unit. But zero tolerance policy itself has continued for people who are not with their families. And so a lot of the public safety outcomes that we are seeing are still going on.
That brings us to the ICE raids, which we're being told are set to begin this weekend in, I think, 10 of the biggest cities or metro areas in the United States. There have certainly been deportations in past administrations. The Obama administration, I believe, deported more people than any administration before it, but these were people who were considered imminent potential public threats. Whereas now they're targeting anybody who's in the country illegally, including ancillary deportations. If they're raiding somebody else and they find somebody who's not documented, they're going to round them up and deport them also. Is this part of the zero tolerance policy, and are these raids helpful?
Zero tolerance deals specifically with prosecutions. This is about who we arrest.
Okay.
So the ICE, but it is similar in the sense that it's part and parcel of the Trump administration's immigration policy. So these ICE raids, which are supposed to take place this Sunday, is targeting a list of 2,000 immigrants or illegal immigrants who missed their immigration court dates. We do not think that that's a smart policy. These are people who are largely nonviolent. They're with families. And so when we are telling Immigrations and Customs Enforcement to target these people for missing court dates, that is law enforcement resources that could be spent on more pressing public safety threats.
We've also got the family separations. You've mentioned them also. This was pitched in part to deter other immigration or other migrants from coming up. If they see that families are being separated, the thought is, well, they won't leave their homes in the first place. And you could, I guess, understand the bad conditions at those sites as being part of that deterrent factor. But is there any indication that that deterrence is actually working as a policy?
No, not at all. There's actually a good case that about 10 years ago, these sort of shows of force and actions that are meant to deter might have worked because the composition of illegal immigrants was largely Mexican, young single males looking for work, and so the stakes were lower. What we're seeing now is that these are families, a lot of times unaccompanied minors and teenagers, who are fleeing very dangerous conditions in their home country. There's been some really interesting research that has shown that they are being much more motivated by what we call push factors, so things that are happening in their own countries. And so this idea that, you know, the administration can scare them into not coming in the future really doesn't pan out in reality, because whatever, you know, our enforcement is doing is not going to be, nor should it be, as scary and as fear-inducing as what's happening in their home countries.
So if it's not a deterrent, it just becomes cruelty for cruelty's sake. The administration also tries to frame its border policies as saying, hey, we got to do this to stop the tide of drugs that are flowing into the country and stop the impact of these human traffickers. Any indication it's doing either of those things?
Unfortunately, the reality is that it's had the opposite effect. So under zero tolerance, like I said, we had these low-level illegal entry cases that prosecutors are now pursuing en masse. Those cases now constitute over half of the federal docket for prosecutions. And so we've seen large-scale drug trafficking and human smuggling units. Those prosecutions have actually decreased as a result of that. So whatever, you know, justification there's been towards trying to crack down on drugs, it's had the opposite effect.
So you work for a conservative think tank. I want to ask you the conservative critical question to some of the points that you've indicated here. You're basically saying these policies don't make the system better. It makes it work worse. But they are still people who did enter the country illegally. I'm assuming the conservative argument would be you got to penalize or otherwise, you know, take actions against the people who have broken that law. How do you respond to people who look at it as such a clear black and white issue? They broke the law. It doesn't matter how serious that violation was. They should be penalized for it.
Sure. So we are not at all making the argument that you get a free pass for breaking the law simply because you're not as dangerous as someone else. What we are saying, though, is that by ICE's own data, the Trump administration last year set a record for the most arrests of people without criminal histories. So that doesn't mean that the conservative view says we just give people passes and they get to cross the border illegally. What it does mean is that we should allow our prosecutors and our officers to go after people who are real dangers to our community and allow them to prioritize those cases. They're not currently allowed to do that.
Jonathan Haggerty is a journalist and also a manager of criminal justice and civil liberties at the group R Street. Jonathan, I appreciate some of the insight and analysis. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Up next, we pivot to the presidential race and how the polls have been shaken up as we approach yet another round of debates.